The most talked about midterm election of our lifetime is upon us. How is our data influencing our entire political process and even our democracy? The world of politics meets the world of data. Today, on the Q Factor. Hi, everybody. I'm Gregg Fisher. Welcome to the Q Factor, my new podcast series that looks at the world through a data-driven lens. If you know me, it's probably through my work at Gerstein, the quantitative investment advisory firm I founded in 1993. I'm the portfolio manager. If you don't know me, all you really need to know is that I'm curious, like you. I'm curious about how data is changing every aspect of the world around us. We feel it in positive ways. We can keep track of our kids, our investments, and our health more accurately than ever. But it can also feel disconcerting. Sometimes it feels as though our phones know us better than we know ourselves. That's exactly why I launched this podcast. I want to know as much as I can about how our world is being quantified. On the Q Factor, I'll be speaking with people from all walks of life. Thought leaders from the business world, technology, the arts, even cooking and parenting. Every couple of weeks on this podcast, I'll be sharing these conversations with you. Because the more you know about our data-driven world, the better choices you'll be able to make. Let's start with one of the biggest choices ahead of us, the midterm elections. My guest today is an expert in the exploding nexus of data and politics. His name is Ethan Roeder. Ethan is the campaign director for an organization called Forward Majority. He was also the data director for President Obama's 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns. But I just want to say at the outset that the Q Factor is not a partisan political podcast. This isn't about how one side can win or should win. So here's my interview with Ethan Roeder. Ethan, welcome. Thanks for coming on the Q Factor.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
So first off, let's start with some background about this intersection of data and politics. If you take us back 10 to 15 years or so, what are the most important ways that you think data has started to insert itself in the political process?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big question, and I think it's still playing out around us. I don't think that we fully understand yet all the ways that data and qualitative analysis is going to inform the way that people engage politically, the way that politicians make sense of policy, the way that politicians engage voters. These are things that are all still rapidly changing, along with lots of other aspects of our lives, right? In America, in the sort of professional practice of political engagement, there have been practitioners who've been using statistical techniques to sort of evaluate the electorate and guide strategic decision-making for some time. And then more recently, you have micro-targeting, which is basically just building a statistical model to determine at the individual level who is most likely to be receptive to a certain message or to a certain type of intervention.
Well, hold that thought. That's actually really cool. And for the benefit of all of our listeners, can you expand on that a little? Just maybe re-explain that, for those of us that have never heard that term before.
Yeah, sure. I think micro-targeting goes back about 15 years in politics. And there's a guy who's still around who was one of the first people who did this, at least on the Democratic side. His name is Ken Strasma. And what micro-targeting is a way of using statistical techniques to create an individual level model that informs the program that you're running. So let me break that down a little bit.
Thank you.
When you're running a campaign, there's kind of 3 or 4 main areas of intervention. There's 3 or 4 main kind of buckets that your program might fall into. One of them is turnout. So you want to try and get more of your supporters to actually cast a ballot. One of them is persuasion. So you want to actually take somebody who's already likely to vote and persuade them to vote for you instead of voting for your opponent. One of them, of course, is fundraising. You want to convince people to give money to your candidate or your cause. Another one would be volunteering. It's sort of similar to fundraising. You want to find people who are likely to actually spend some of their time knocking doors or making phone calls. And for all of these different program areas, you might have a statistical model, and your model will actually tell you, here are the people who are most likely to actually cast a ballot, to actually vote this year, and are most likely to be persuaded by, for instance, a message on healthcare or a message on education. And if you look at the list of voters, the way a lot of these models work is they literally have a score between 0 and 100. And 0 means it's hopeless, and 100 means this is your best possible target. And so you pick the people with the really high scores, and those are the people you go after with your persuasion message. And it's really just a more sophisticated version of what politicians have been doing for a long time, which is knowing their audience, right? It's making informed decisions about what issues to talk about with which groups of people.
That makes a lot of sense. I love the level of precision that involves, and it seems so much more effective than using the same methods we were using 100 years ago. Maybe the concepts are similar, but applying a scientific process, using data, math, statistics to really hone in on where you're focusing, that just seems like such an obvious thing as you say it out loud.
Yeah, no, that's certainly the way I think of it. There are some who look at the mystery, they see these statistical techniques that are used, and it seems kind of creepy, it seems kind of mysterious, and it seems that there might be, more opportunity to manipulate folks because we're using these statistical techniques. I think it's exactly the opposite. I tend to think of it in the terms that you just laid out, which is this is just a better way for elected officials to know what people are concerned about, what issues people are actually passionate about, and then to just meet them where they're at.
Yeah, it's focusing on what we think matters to those folks. That makes sense to me. Well, at this moment in time, I think a historic moment, no matter which side you're on, do you believe that data provides a greater benefit or a greater threat to the American electoral process and American democracy?
Another big question. And of course, it's a question that extends beyond our borders.
Yes.
These challenges, are challenges that other countries are wrestling with as well. Although I'll say I haven't visited, a bunch of other places, but I've been to Canada, I've been to Germany, France, the UK, and by and large, we're much further ahead in the United States on how we use these tools, how sophisticated they are, how well developed they are. It's partly due to the fact that, frankly, we spend more money on campaigns here, and so we're more likely to develop more sophisticated tools because of that. But to get to your question about sort of, whether or not it's helpful or harmful, I think it can be both. I think data is a tool, like any technology, and it can certainly be used in ways that undermine and undercut forces of democracy and people's ability to get access to transparent information. I think we've seen in the last couple of years the conversation really become louder and louder around what we call fake news. And to me, I think fake news is another way of saying sort of curated misinformation.
That's a good term.
It's not like we're just blasting lies, to anybody who will listen. It's really very deliberately curating specific messages to specific audiences, in the interest of deceiving them, in the interest of pulling them in a certain direction for a strategic reason. And of course, that can be used for nefarious purposes. Of course, that can be used to undermine democracy. My feeling is that data also allows us to understand, first of all, not only the fact that that's happening in the first place so that we can counteract it, but it also helps us understand, all right, well, how do we get people back? How do we win people back? And I just don't think that the way that we engage people has to only be, okay, let's play whack-a-mole. Let's just try and find fake news and kill it everywhere we find it. I think there has to be an engagement side of that coin also. What do we replace it with? What are we engaging people around? What can we bring to them that will be more compelling to them or as compelling to them as this fake news is, that'll bring them back into some sort of space where we can be more unified and we can actually find common ground. And I think data is just as valuable for that as it is for the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about how this applies to experiences I've had in finance, but this concept of decision architecture, who it is that's behind the messaging and how it's teed up and how it's orchestrated to influence people to make choices. Hopefully you're helping people to make healthy choices, but people have different perspectives on what a healthy choice is. And if this kind of data and knowledge and information is put in the wrong hands, it could be a scary thing, actually. So I could see how this could be good and bad.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm glad you made that point, because I think there's a close relationship between social science and data. Data itself, of course, is just structured information, but what do you actually do with it? What your goal is, I think very quickly become questions of social science. And as you mentioned, decision architecture and sort of giving nudges to people. If I suppose maybe this is stretching the analogy too far, but if you imagine, where fruits and vegetables are placed in a high school cafeteria, physically where they're situated at the buffet, so that it nudges kids to make a healthy decision, to pick an apple instead of a bag of Fritos. The same sorts of architecture exists in our democracy, right? And the same sorts of design decisions influence whether or not somebody decides to vote, whether or not they decide to register, whether or not, it's on their route home to swing by the early vote location. There's a lot of things like that fit into the social science realm that we can do to help encourage participation.
Yeah, there's a lot of learning there. We were fortunate enough about 10 years ago in the middle of the financial crisis, we had Richard Thaler, when he launched his book, Nudge, come and speak with us, a group of our investors. And I remember thinking about that concept back then. These things are delicate, but important and powerful. I think as we think about this, there's been an enormous amount of discussion about the interference in the 2016 presidential election. And I'm just wondering, do you believe that Russians or other outside forces are using Americans' personal data to influence the upcoming elections?
Yeah, I certainly do. I believed it in 2016. I remember at the time, I think I'm the sort of person who, to a fault, ends up viewing things like this and not seeing a conspiracy. I sort of tend to explain away the conspiracy aspect of things like this. I sort of subscribe to the notion that most of the bad things that happen in our lives are either just, by virtue of the fact that life is hard, or it's because people aren't paying attention, they're lazy, they're distracted. It's basically people making mistakes as opposed to people deliberately wanting to inflict harm. And I approached the news in 2016 about Russia's interference with the same kind of skepticism. But I have to say, the more I read about it, and the more I heard from friends of mine who I trust, who work in IT, who know exactly how to sort of read the signals, read the traffic, and understand what's going on there, the more compelled I became by the argument. And it just seems to me at this point to be obvious that there are foreign powers, like Russia most prominently, who have a vested interest in seeing American political discourse go in a certain direction, seeing American political power be formed in a certain way. And why wouldn't they use all the tools available to them to do that? So, yeah, I do believe it's happening.
So, I learned this reading through some of the materials regarding forward majority and some conversations I had with a few of your colleagues there. So there's a great deal of voter data that's public, and it's always been public. But what's different now? Specifically, what data does the typical voter know he or she is volunteering, and what data does he or she have no idea that we're volunteering?
Yeah, that's a great question. I imagine it probably varies from voter to voter. I imagine some people in general, they're more aware of how much of their data is out there and where it lives than others. And when I think about voter data, I often also think about other forms of personal data that we all make available to others. For instance, our spending patterns, our online behavior. There are lots of commercial and governmental entities out there that have a tremendous amount of information about us that we might not be aware that they have about us. And so in that respect, I think a voter file or a voter list is actually one of the more transparent places where we can find out exactly what's known about us. We can actually go and look at it ourselves. And it's ironic that that transparency sort of calls attention to it in a negative way and can tend to make people a little bit more weary of what's out there about them, when in fact, there's so much more information out there about you in hidden places than you might ever know. To answer your question more directly about exactly what's out there, it varies from state to state. Different states keep different types of information about people. By and large, they're going to have your name, they're going to have your address. If the voter registration form asks it, they might even have your phone number. They might have your race. In some southern states, the voter registration application is required to have a question about race. And they might have your birthday. Some states only publish the year of your birth. Other states will publish, your full birthday. And in every state, not a lot of voters know about this, but in every state, there's an option to keep your information anonymous so that only the Secretary of State, the election office, has access to your information, and it won't be published to any campaign or any other entity. Most people don't know that option exists, but it does.
How do you select that option?
It's a great question, Greg. I'm actually not sure exactly how you do that.
So that's a good example of decision architecture, right?
Yeah. I mean, I imagine you would call the Secretary of State's office and you'd say, listen, I want you to put a flag on my record and keep it anonymous, and they would honor that. But very few people actually do that, I think, partly because, it's not easy to do.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think about that. It'd probably be hard to not pick up on this concept of data, the electoral process, without talking about Facebook. I mean, how has Facebook changed our electoral process and our democratic norms?
Yeah, you make a good point. Any campaign is going to have access to information that goes beyond just what's on the voter file. So we acquire what's called consumer data. I imagine that this is data that you work with in your industry as well, Greg.
Yes.
And it enhances the voter file data we have. So it tells us a lot more about the individuals that we want to talk to, other than just the literal information that the Secretary of State publishes. And Facebook is certainly an important component of that landscape as well. Facebook has a tremendously powerful range of options for engaging people based on, a variety of interests that they might have, groups they might be a member of, different demographic factors. Those things, I would say, were more relevant earlier on in the evolution of online engagement. And of course, we're still in the infancy of the internet. So when I say early on, I mean like 10 years ago.
Right.
Nowadays, and this actually has just changed within the last couple of years, we do all individual level targeting online. And so I work with my digital vendor. Here's what that means.
Thank you.
It basically means I don't have to rely on whatever categories Facebook has come up with. Even though those can be useful, I'm not limited to those. What I can do is I can take all of the enhanced information that I have on my end, all that consumer data, all that voter file data, census data, geographic data. I can run my statistical model. I can determine who the individuals are that I want to engage around healthcare. And I then go to my digital vendor and I say, I'm going to send you a list, 245,000 people in Florida who I want to serve up this healthcare ad. And my digital vendor then goes to Facebook, but they also go to YouTube, they go to smart TV. They do matching across a number of different services, streaming, video services, social media services, and they individually match the people I want to reach to those platforms. And it's really amazing. I mean, it used to be the case that really just as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, that if you used that approach, your match rate would be 50 or 60%. And the technology has improved so much just in the last couple of years that our match rate now, not for any one platform, it still might only be 60% for Facebook,
right,
but across all half dozen different approaches that we take, we can match 96, 97, 98% of our list.
Wow. That's impressive. That's incredible.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Well, when I think back to Facebook and the use of this data and some of the things we're talking about, there was this, obviously the Cambridge Analytica scandal was probably the most significant in Facebook's history. If you could, I'm sure that resonates for you. Could you take us through the key details of that story? What was different about that kind of data that was harvested in the process versus the kind of data that, we're now talking about or that people knowingly volunteer?
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad you asked about this because I do think there's a lot of misconception about what Cambridge Analytica was doing and what was wrong about it. And the distinction that I would make is it's actually less about the data they had access to. It's more about how they used it. So the approach that they took was very similar to the approach that any campaign would take, where, again, we have a list of people we want to reach. We match them against these online platforms. We might ask people to give us some information back. We might ask them to fill out a survey. And so we did this on the Obama campaign in 2012, very similar to what Cambridge Analytica did. But the one key difference is that when we did it on the Obama campaign, we told people, we are the Obama campaign, and we want to ask you some questions. Please fill out this form. Please fill out this questionnaire. It was obvious to the user on the other end of the screen exactly who they were giving their information to, and they could imagine what it might be used for. It's going to be used for political communications. That's not what Cambridge Analytica did. What Cambridge Analytica did is they created all of these games, these sort of third-party, very innocent-sounding surveys. It might be, which character from Sex and the City are you? And you put in some personal information, answer a few questions about, your purchasing habits, who knows? And then it tells you, oh, you're a Samantha. Well, what you don't know is that you have just given a bunch of information.
That's horrible.
To this weird firm in the UK that is now, reselling it to anyone on the open market who wants to use it, for whatever purpose they want to use it for.
It's amazing. Scary. Well, many of our listeners are investors, working with our firm or just, investors in general, and they're deeply invested in the outcome of this upcoming midterm election. And many of them have donated to campaigns, even campaigns outside their own state. You have a fascinating theory that I stumbled on recently in something that you had written about how to make your campaign donation strategy optimally effective. And you called it the modern portfolio theory for campaigns, which was perfect for me. I mean, modern portfolio theory is, something that runs through the veins of our investment shop. This idea of, spreading your risks, putting your dollars in areas where you think your risk-adjusted returns are going to be high. This just really, really worked for me. And I was excited to talk to you about this, amongst other things, of course. Could you just break that down for us a little and tell us what you meant by that?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's two big problems in the way that campaigns are funded in America. The first big problem is that too few races end up getting any attention. And there are, 100 senators, 435 members of Congress, and tens of thousands of members of state legislatures around the country. And then, a multiple of that, people in local offices, attorneys general, mayors, all of these other offices. And the number of, as to be expected, unless, you live and breathe this stuff, the number of those candidates you ever actually hear about is just a very small proportion. And so you end up with a situation where there's kind of superstar races and superstar candidates. And at the expense of a lot of other really worthwhile candidates out there who are running for important seats, who may even be better aligned with your interests in terms of policy, but you don't necessarily ever find out about them because they just aren't getting any of the oxygen, in the media. So that's the first problem, is there's too few races that the money is directed to. The second problem is there's really no rational cap that's put on the amount of money that a campaign will spend in order to win an election. I actually just saw today the Beto O'Rourke campaign in Texas, running for Senate in Texas, of course, against Ted Cruz, announced that he had raised, I think it was $38 million in one quarter. And he announced that this was the most money that any Senate race has ever raised in a single quarter. They've completely shattered all previous fundraising records for a single quarter. Sounds right. I mean, $38 million is a boatload of money. There have been Senate races, of course, that have spent more than that total. But within a single quarter, they're breaking the record. And what I see over and over again, because I'm on the sausage making end of this, is, campaigns that are lucky enough to be the Beto O'Rourke campaign, and they have tens of millions of dollars in the bank. And remember, you and I are talking, Greg, on the 12th of October. We're less than 4 weeks away from Election Day. That means Beto O'Rourke, it's like Brewster's Millions. He's got less than 4 weeks to spend $38 million plus whatever else comes in the bank.
That's unreal.
In the next month.
That's really crazy.
The fact of the matter is, the raw truth, if you want to, I feel like I'm the magician who's like, reveals the tricks, like, well, look, the bird was just in a little piece of netting in my sleeve. The reality is there is no way for the campaign to spend that money in an effective way in the next 4 weeks.
So what will they spend it on?
They'll spend it on trinkets. They'll spend it on swag. They'll spend it on round after round after round of paid phone calls. And I'm sure that at some point we've all been in the unfortunate position to be living in a battleground state in election year, and your phone is ringing off the hook and you've got a pile of glossy mail on your front porch, and it just doesn't make a difference anymore. At the point that you've gotten your fifth phone call, you're just not paying attention to it anymore. So my proposal was, rather than getting too caught up in these individual candidates that we fall in love with, let's take a step back and let's think about how money gets spent across all of these races as if it were a portfolio. And let's try and adjust our investment accordingly. And I think if we do that, we will make two decisions. The first decision we'll make is, all right, these campaigns that are all the way up into the tens of millions of dollars, there's a certain point at which they don't need any more money because it's not going to make a difference anyway. It's not actually going to have a real impact. They're what I would call, not to stretch the analogy too much, but they're what I would call an overvalued, equity, an overvalued campaign. And instead, let's give money to some of the more marginal races. Maybe it's a tougher race. I'm personally a Democrat. I support Democrats. So I would want to look for a Democratic candidate running in a race that's maybe there's less money, there's less attention, but I know that the dollar that I give to that race is going to go farther. And that's basically the concept.
It seems so logical when we say it out loud. So you were Obama's data director in 2008. And I remember, we didn't know each other at that time, but I remember reading about how effective that campaign was, probably the first of its kind to use data in this way, which I thought was super interesting. So 2016, of course, was a different story. Going in, I think many assumed that Hillary Clinton's campaign was the more sophisticated data-wise, but that may not have been the case. Putting aside the issue of the Russian interference for the moment, what did the Trump campaign do most effectively in 2016's election in terms of using data to their advantage?
Yeah, great question. And again, I think that you have touched on a weakness in the narrative that we heard coming out of 2008, 2012, 2016. I was also the data director on the 2012 campaign, and I actually wrote an op-ed just after that campaign in the New York Times, basically asking people not to praise me so much. My op-ed was sort of boiled down to, I'm not some magician. I'm not a wizard who has powers beyond all scale. I'm just a guy who pays attention to spreadsheets. But the coverage of the work that we did on both Obama campaigns in 2008 and 2012 was kind of breathless, and it was very laudatory. And, I don't want to take away from our accomplishments, and I certainly do feel proud of what we did, and I think we innovated. But I also don't think that the reason we won either of those elections was because we had a sophisticated data shop. I think it was because we had a very good candidate, and we had the candidate who was able to connect with voters and who voters ultimately decided they wanted to be our president. So again, with Trump, yes, I can certainly say that the Trump campaign was famously put a lot of resources into digital testing. They did a ton of digital ads. I think they were probably more deliberate about engaging people on Facebook and other platforms like that. Whereas the Hillary campaign had a little bit more of an academic approach. I think they definitely had a better equipped analytics team than the Trump campaign did. But, how did they use that analytics team? I think there's an argument that they might not have been doing as good a job as they could have, actually listening to what people on the ground were telling them. What is our staff in Wisconsin telling us? Are they giving us any warning signs? What about Michigan? Are they giving us any warning signs? And if they had been a little better, I think, about listening to those red flags kind of bubbling up from their own organization, from their own people that were on the ground, even if it conflicted with what their statistics were telling them, statistics are always a trailing indicator. You're always building your model on top of data that's been gathered from things that have happened in the past. And I don't know if this is the case or not, but maybe the Trump campaign was just better at kind of allowing their gut, allowing their feel for where the electorate was at to inform the way they approached the election. And, I'm usually arguing against putting too much faith in your gut as somebody who considers, myself, evidence-based and data-driven. But I don't think you can cut it out completely. When you cut it out completely, you're making decisions in a vacuum, and you run into trouble that way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We use quantitative methods at our firm to invest, but I always say, there's one of the factors we refer to as the common sense factor. It's just an informed human being at the end of all of these things, whether it's the beginning or the end, but somewhere there. And this other point about listening, I think we all learn that in business and our lives. You've got to be on the lookout for that ambiguous information. Somewhere out there, someone's trying to tell you something, and there's plenty of case studies about all kinds of topics where, if you're not listening and paying attention, you're going to miss something. So I think that's really important to have heard. I'm bringing us right through to almost the current moment, in the history of the use of data and all of this. And it gets me to this Brexit in 2016, which of course was a big deal. And I think as a result of that, many people have become quite skeptical of polling. And I just wonder if you have a thought on this. Has your trust in polling changed? And, what do you currently trust or distrust polling-wise from a data perspective?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. And it's funny. So I didn't work on a presidential campaign in 2016. I did some freelance work. I worked for an advocacy group that engages young Latino voters. But I certainly stay in touch with folks who work at that level. And after the 2016 campaign, I asked this question of not only the analytics director for the Hillary campaign, but also for a number of other modelers who work in the political space, who build these statistical models. And I got very confident opposite answers, depending on who I asked. I had a conversation with one person, and he just completely poo-pooed it. He said, I just think that's ridiculous. I think it's all about how you weight it. Obviously you have to do multimodal. You have to be doing live calls plus some internet polling. You can't just rely on one channel or the other, because you're going to be missing kind of a chunk of the people that you need to be hearing from. But as long as you're doing a multimodal poll, and as long as you're weighting it appropriately, we're fine. The polling is fine. We can get a pretty good sense, same as it ever was. We can get a pretty good sense of where we stand. And I talked to somebody else, also somebody I really respect, who's very well established in the business, who does this work for a living. And he said, absolutely, I think there's a polling crisis. Nobody's figured it out. The only way to really tackle this these days is just to do multiple polls. You just have to do 2, 3, 4 polls over time. And only if they all kind of point in the same direction can you have any confidence that you're sort of in the right ballpark. But other than that, it's a complete crapshoot. So I'm not sure which one of those is the right answer.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. So, if you look around the U.S., Democrats and Republicans alike, is there anything that's really impressing you right now? Like who do you see is really doing the best job at using data to their advantage?
That is a great question. I think that might be a question I would be better equipped to answer in 2 months rather than right now. I'm so deep down into my tunnel. I have tunnel vision. I'm just focused on what's in front of me, and I'd like to think we're doing a pretty good job of using a unique approach that's also highly effective. I have. I'm just thinking if I can come up with any examples of groups. I know that Civis Analytics, for instance, which is founded by Dan Wagner. Dan Wagner was the analytics director for Obama in 2012. They're doing quite a bit of work right now on two things that are very important, one of which is video testing, so testing the efficacy of digital videos, and another one is being able to build statistical models at the local level. It'd be nice if, a campaign didn't have to be a Senate campaign or a presidential campaign in order to benefit from statistical modeling. So they're experimenting with, creating some tools that are useful at a more local level. I'm sure there are some campaigns that are doing interesting things right now too. Yeah, right. I'm just not sure.
Well, that'll be a subject for our next talk in a couple of months, I hope.
That's right.
Yeah. So maybe if you wouldn't mind to take a moment and give us a little information about your organization, sort of a bit of a plug. What's your website? How can people find you and follow you and support you?
Sure, I'm happy to. So the organization I work for is called Forward Majority. You can find us at forwardmajority.org. And we are exclusively focused on flipping state legislatures from Republican to Democrat control. And we're doing this in strategic states where many of them have a Republican trifecta, states where we know redistricting is coming up after the 2020 census. And if all three levers of power, the governor plus the state house plus the state senate, if all three are controlled by Republicans, then they can draw any lines they want. They can create these gerrymandered maps that, of course, have a profound impact over the course of 10 years. And so our goal is to be as strategic as possible about investing in those undervalued races at the state legislative level, not necessarily the top of the list, the ones that are, getting the most money, but tougher races a little bit further down the list, in the interest of putting the entire chamber in play and actually flipping some of these chambers to Democratic control and introducing a little bit more equity in the landscape of partisan control at the state level.
So we have this segment on the Q Factor called the 3 Qs. These are 3 questions that we're asking all of our guests, no matter what their background or expertise. So one is, beyond politics in your case, where do you see big data having the biggest positive impact on the world over the next 10 years? I mean, it could be science, manufacturing, investing, philanthropy, health, climate change, any of these topics. Where and how do you think big data will help the world the most?
That's a good question. I'm gonna take a second to think about that.
You got it. Yeah, it is a big question. I've been I'm finding myself asking this question to most people I'm talking to these days because it's interesting to think about, and none of us really know for sure, but there's a lot of work to do out there.
The first way I'd answer that question is by I find myself asking myself what has changed the most in the last 10 years.
Good point. So many things.
Yeah, I'm wanting the past to inform my prediction of what's going to come in the future. And I think that some of the things that stand out for me are, first of all, global hunger. Over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, we've cut global hunger about in half. Really profound improvement in the basic quality of life for people across the world. Of course, there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done, but I think global health and global hunger, we've seen a tremendous amount of improvement.
That's great. Thanks. Well, on the flip side, for question number 2, What aspect of the world do you see as being the most threatened by big data over the next 10 years?
Yeah, my first response to that is income inequality. But I think it's actually broader than income inequality. I think it's more like a concentration of wealth, a concentration of power, a concentration of influence. I do think that as authoritarian states are able to make decisions about what information people have access to, they censor particular words and phrases, they can limit where people can go and what they can be exposed to. It does introduce the possibility that, like we were talking about earlier, data can be used for good. It's a tool. It can be used for good. It can also be used for bad. And the increased access to information means that those few people who currently have wealth and power potentially have the ability to further concentrate their power and further concentrate their influence, based on this powerful data set that they have available to them.
Yeah, thank you. So our last question for today, question 3, artificial intelligence. It's like the buzzword. I don't think you can go to a party or sit at a bar, end a day without someone asking you about artificial intelligence in some way. What do you think about this? Is it a friend or a foe?
I think that artificial intelligence is an aspect of interpersonal relationships that is unavoidable. I don't think that it's either a friend or a foe. I just think that it's an aspect of reality. And what I mean by that is I have had experiences myself where I've been interacting with some online chatbot, or I've been, talking to an automated voice, and I've kind of lost myself in it a little bit. I've found myself, I find it more and more likely to expect these things to pass the Turing test, where it's indistinguishable to me whether or not this is a human or just an algorithm. And honestly, not to get too heady about it, but at a certain point I wonder, well, what's the difference? I mean, we create our own personalities, we create our own algorithms, our own systems of understanding who we are and how we interact with each other. And we then imbue the things that we create with those same algorithms, with those same systems of interaction. So I don't see AI as necessarily being like an external threat that has the potential to destroy us all. I just see it as being like a more powerful aspect of ourselves. So just like everything we've already been talking about in this whole conversation, Gregg, like it can be used for good or evil. It's a magnification of ourselves. It could be good. It could be bad. I don't necessarily see it inherently as a threat. I just see it as more of ourselves coming to light.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was at a conference not too long ago, and I was there listening in, and someone asked a question to someone who's focusing on AI or artificial intelligence. Said, will computers learn how to love? And he said, well, they're not going to learn how to love, but they're going to learn how to understand what you think love is, and they'll make you think that they love you.
Right.
And I thought, wow, that was a really good answer. Like, I kind of got that, It will be interesting. I hope you and I are talking together 10 years from now, looking back and, seeing where this all played out. Here we are in October 2018. I know we're entering a really important time for the work you do. I'm so thankful, Ethan Roeder, for being here with us today. I really appreciate your time and your insights. It's a fascinating discussion, and look forward to having you back sometime soon.
It's my pleasure, Gregg. Thanks so much for having me.
See you soon. Thank you. So that was my conversation with Ethan Roeder. I hope you found it as illuminating as I did. Over the coming weeks, we'll be looking at more corners of the world through a data-driven lens. We'll look at how data is affecting science, finance, arts and entertainment, everything. I'm Gregg Fisher. Thanks for listening to The Q Factor.
Gregg Fisher is Portfolio Manager and Head of Research at Gerstein Fisher, a division of People's United Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor and a wholly owned subsidiary of People's United Bank, N.A. Economic and market views and forecasts stated by Mr. Fisher are current as of the date of this podcast and are subject to change without notice. Mr. Fisher is not soliciting any action based on this material. It is for general informational purposes only. The views of the guests that appear on the Q Factor are their own and may not reflect the views of Mr. Fisher or Gerstein Fisher.